Thanks very much, everybody. I hope you enjoyed our speed networking event. I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dan Jennings from Veritas, who've kindly sponsored, are the main sponsors for this event. So I shall hand you over to Dan now. Yours.
Thank you very much, Diana. I'm very careful there because the last time I stepped on this stage I nearly ruined that and nearly broke my arm as well, so well, it wasn't quite that dramatic. But anyway, thank you very much everybody firstly for your time today. Really appreciate it. I heard voice of year end. I suffer the same thing in a different way, so I appreciate your time is valuable. Thank you. Thank you also to Diana for asking us to come along. I understand this was off the back of a conversation that Diana and Roddy had together, my colleague Roddy over there. The conversation went along the lines of, we didn't know you did that sort of thing, and we didn't know you did it in that sort of way. We think it might be interesting to explain it to a broader audience, so here I am. Finally, thank you to Michelle and Kenny for doing half my job for me today. I can't see them now, but they must be here somewhere. Thank you, Kenny, for describing the problems that we talk with our customers about every single day. I've been doing this job for around about 15 years now. I'm a technical account manager for Veritas. And I speak with customers about managing information every single day, and they describe exactly the challenges, and they want to have exactly the same solutions on the similar or larger scale than we've had described today, So I'm glad to hear we're slightly in tune. The first thing that I would say is that addressing the challenge of being able to understand how to manage information, how to deliver it, and how to make sure it's properly addressed for its entire life cycle is to understand that information is not data. Data is a series of blocks of information. Oh dear, I'm getting far too technical now, but it's a series of blocks of information, of ins and outs, of ones and zeros, stuff which is probably causing you to glaze over right now. It causes my wife and my daughter to glaze over on a very regular basis. Information is the intellectual property. It's what you write down with the pen. It's what you type out on the keyboard. It's not that series of ones and zeros. And traditionally, that's been an okay approach to storing information digitally, because although the amount of information we've stored over the years has been going up, it hasn't been going up on the same rate that it's going up today. Social media, the increasing speed at which we can access information and where we can access it, and I've left my phone down there, but that's a principal proponent of it, is leading to a massive increase in the rate of information stored. And where it's being stored is yet another challenge. It's all over the place. I've got some figures there which yet don't mean anything, but the rate of growth of unstructured information, that's the stuff that we might put in SharePoint, we might put in shared drives, in storage in the cloud, whatever cloud you care to mention, or on-premise, is growing at twice the rate of structured data. Structured data has always been very easy to handle. We've got a database, we've got a structure behind the information that we put in there. Nice and easy, thanks very much. But if we've got a collection of files, if we've got images and videos and voice recordings and etc., they're much more difficult to handle. That presents a challenge in itself. And 90% of all that information, typically speaking, is unknown. I'm getting a little bit of feedback here. I don't know if we can address that anyhow. No, maybe not. I'll use an analogy. My wife a couple of years ago asked for a new kitchen. She woke me up with that information one morning that she wanted one, and that's great. And I wanted a new kitchen too, and that's lovely. 2 years later, we've got it. It's got all those soft closed doors and lovely things that nice lights in places that I didn't know you could put lights. It's also got one of these. In fact, oh no, it's got this. This is the other one. Right, I did have a picture of my own one, but anyway, you take the point. That is the untidy kitchen drawer that hopefully you can all relate. Well, actually, I hope you can't relate to it. But you probably all can relate to it. It's got useful stuff in there. I know that because I need to get it out occasionally. But it's also got sticky sweets from my daughter. It's got the odd bill that I didn't expect to be put in there. It's got items relating to the dog. I'm not very happy about that. And it's got the occasional sharp knife. So when I go into that drawer to get information that I want, things that I want, slipping up there, I end up possibly with sticky sweets or even a bleeding finger. I'll get what I want, but I'll get bitten along the way. That's very analogous to how information is stored within a digital circle. And that is a heritage that we've had over the 20 years that I've been in the business. So a project comes along from a business unit, it forms a little committee, and that they sit down over lots of coffee and maybe the occasional drink, and they will decide that they need some servers and they need some storage and they need some other bits of networky stuff that I've never understood, and they also need some software, and they go off and they build their little fiefdom, and that's absolutely fine. And that service that project builds is probably very good in itself. But there are a number of other projects being built by that one business unit with isolated information, with separate infrastructure, with separate storage. And occasionally they want to use the same data, use that word advisedly, between projects. So they copy the data around and they get multiple versions of it, and they get different people owning it, or actually somebody called admin, or for those of you who've ever used Unix computers, root, somebody called root, who must be very prolific in the workplace, because I see it all over the place. Nobody knows who owns what, where, why, and how they're using it. Then we multiply that over multiple business units. And for any public body, for any business, that represents a problem. We have that inefficiency, that isolated information, that separate infrastructure over all the business units within an organisation. Oh, and then about 5 years ago, we emerged from the trough of disillusionment that was the promise of cloud storage, and now we've got public clouds, private clouds, hybrid clouds, whatever that means. It probably means something slightly different to each of you here. And people are using information, they're putting information in all those areas. Something like 45% of all the businesses we work with don't know how many cloud infrastructures they're using, because business units don't necessarily need to go to IT for storage anymore. They go off and they get some from Dropbox and they think it's free and they think that's fine, and they use that. And we know this because we work with 75% of all FTSE 100 businesses in the UK. We work with pretty much every public body in the UK, and we work with organisations all over the world. 83% of the Fortune 500. There's a whole stack of those bits of information. I was really interested in what Michel said earlier about redundant, obsolete, and trash, or rot, as it's often shortened to. Very appropriate naming convention. We also refer to rot as stuff that companies know that they've got. There was a Donald Rumsfeld thing once, wasn't there? I know there's some stuff I know, some stuff I don't know that Well, I know I don't know, and then there's the stuff that I don't know, and that's what really bothers me. Now, leave aside the moment people's thinking about Donald Rumsfeld positive or negative. It's not a bad analogy with information. There's plenty of that dark unknown data, and even if you can't see the figures there, that big red thing represents over half the information that everybody's got, and they don't even that every organisation in Europe has. They don't even know what it is. They can't tell us themselves anything about that information. We commission every so often an independent report, the state of the nation for businesses. In EMEA, that represents about 1,400 clients in the public and private sector. In UK and Ireland, I don't know how many this one actually covers at the moment, but this is UK and Ireland specific. We've got copies, and Roddy and I will happily scatter those out. But they support exactly what Michelle was saying earlier, that people don't know what they've got, and they don't know where it is, and they don't know who's using it for what. And that represents, on one level, a cost issue, because storage costs, sorry, we're an American company, so this is a dollar figure. It's about £3.4 million, today's exchange rate, per petabyte per year to store information. Now, I didn't move then, that just did that. It's an old building, there must be something floating around that does that. If we drill down on another of those figures, only 1.5% of all information that an organisation stores is target rich. By target rich, I mean that's the stuff that really makes business happen, stuff happen. In a private sector arena, that would be maybe the intellectual property behind a drug for a pharmaceutical company that hasn't been launched yet. For yourselves, that could be other parts of information which are really critical to the operation of public bodies. And there's all sorts of different versions of that. But the return on investment of that £3.4 million per year is at 1.5%. It's pretty lousy. I don't know anybody that would want to take that as a return on investment. And even if we said, right, okay, there's some business critical information we can chuck in there as well, we're still only talking about 15% on average of all information stored. People tend to treat business storage, information storage, as personal storage. I know I've stored my own photographs on corporate internet, and I'm sure I'm not the only one in this room. Roddy does all the time. If I cut it another way, we can cut this many different ways. We want to understand the 69% of all information on average that organisations have that is of no business, legal or regulatory value whatsoever. Now, understanding that information in the first place, not just SharePoint, and that's a very good example, but if we expand that out to all information being stored anywhere, understanding that information gives you a handle on how to write policy and how to action that information on an ongoing basis. That's potentially very powerful. At Veritas, we've developed a strategy for information management, and it's based on that whole, if you can read the number 1 there at the top, discovery mechanism. Okay, if we can understand, we can give the evidence around who's got what, where they've got it, what they're using it for, who they're delivering it to, and why they're doing it. Then we can make some recommendations. We tend to make, when we engage with organisations, we tend to create a report for them, which gives maybe top 3 recommendations, things that would be relatively straightforward to do in order to rationalise their information structure to potentially reduce costs, but moreover reduce risk and improve business efficiency, organisational efficiency, and then will enable them to execute either automatically, semi-automatically, or if they want to do it manually, that's their choice entirely, policy to do that. And that could be around archiving information, enabling it for e-discovery and legal hold. That could be for data loss prevention, making sure only the right information goes out in the right way to the right people at the right time, and actually making that information more efficient to deliver at higher speeds in the right way by tiering it properly and making sure that we promote what information an organisation actually needs to drive itself forward, and demote the stuff that doesn't. It's just clogging up their systems, it's just clogging up their operational efficiency, and getting rid of stuff where we need to get rid of it. I've heard mention of new regulations coming along from the EU this morning, from Kenny. I won't dare go into that minefield because you know much more about it than I do, but I am aware of it. And new regulations will be coming along, new guidelines will be coming along via relationships that we might have with our friends across the Atlantic, and then who knows what might happen after. I believe that there might be a vote coming up about something to do with the EU, but I don't know, I don't watch the news these days. Point being, we need to right-size now and make sure that we're right-sizing moving forward. There's no point in, if I just nip back there a little bit, there is no point in doing this process once. There is a very good reason why those arrows keep going round. It's got to be an iterative process in order to make sure that we are in the right place in the future as well as today. We got here where we've got very little information, we've got very little handle on information because things were right 20 years ago, but they're not now. It's likely they're not going to be right in 20 years' time either, but let's prepare ourselves for that. So that discovery layer, which I've mentioned, hopefully by now sounds as though it's fairly critical, enables us to to perform the archiving, the e-discovery, the delivery, and the data loss prevention functions that I've mentioned earlier. And we hook in from our discovery layer to those subsequent areas. So those subsequent areas, for instance, archiving, will create recommendations, but we can implement policy from the discovery layer to the archiving. That makes the whole process immensely powerful. It makes it easier for yourselves as well, because it's quite possible for different parts, different functions of an organisation to input to that process. So you might want to involve, and I don't know if there are any people from legal departments here as well as information records management, but if there are, they could be involved via the process as well. And that's just one example. I have got a confession to make. I've got the wrong presentation up here, because the very bits that Diana wanted me to show are not on here. So I'm going to open this one instead, and I hope you can all bear with me just 1 minute. Yes. No, that's not it. The wrong one got moved in. Because you wanted me to show some... Right. Bear with me a moment, everybody, if that's okay with you. See if I can find it. It's lack of, yeah, it's lack of information control, isn't it? Right, let's go off piste here. So, at a very simple level, we can help you understand, for instance, where is mine? This is different to mine. We can understand who's accessing what information where. So we can, for instance, via one of our live reports, you could have a look at an individual file or an individual file share or SharePoint share, and you could see a social you could see a social heat map as to who is accessing what and where. So we like big groups of people because they probably all actually really do have the right access permissions. They probably are entitled to look at a given piece of information. You've all probably got a piece of information in mind. We quite like those collaborative groups of people. What we don't like are funny little people sitting off to the side who are accessing that information, but they're not actually seemingly interacting with any of the other groups here. I'm working with one council at the moment, and they've got around about 4 or 5 of these people, and they've got credentials, they've got names, and we can show in our reports these names, and we do, and they have no idea who those people are. They don't know who those people are. That represents a significant risk to them and to the people that they represent, you and me, the people of their borough. And we're helping them remediate against those sorts of risks. That's the sort of the power of what we can do, and we can understand, we can cut our information up in multiple ways. So, for instance, you might have a share with aged information, and we can produce graphs or charts which let people understand how much of the information in a given share is actually being used in the last week, month, 6 months, year, 7 years, 8 years, you name it. We'll cut it up whichever way you want. So how much of that could be archived off? We can understand what sort of information is in there, so you can understand whether it's appropriate. Should it be there? Should it have a particular policy applied to it? Should it be deleted? I've got one organisation, it's a public body, looks after service personnel. They have to keep information about the service personnel for life plus 10 years. That's not even a solid number. I mean, how long am I going to live? I don't know. I could get lynched today. Sometimes do on stage. The point being is that these feasts are quite movable. They have other bits of information they've got to keep for 7 years. Stuff they've got to delete because somebody's going to be asking for a right to be forgotten. So we've got to have policies in place for each of those. At one point I had some screens for that, but let's take it for red, shall we? So, once we've understood and we've made some decisions and we've implemented some policies, then we can actually start to say to organisations, and we do this, we can share, you can have a shared infrastructure. Remember, we've got the information delivery part in that life cycle as well. Share that information out strategically. Have a standardised approach to how you implement projects through that shared infrastructure and deliver efficiency. That efficiency means that you know who's using what, where, why and how. We do this all over the world, and one particular large, well, let's be honest, financial services bank wanted to secure unstructured data, just as we were talking about earlier, just as you've been talking about earlier. They have a significant amount of information in range. We can, they wanted to target certain areas of their business, not all of it to start with, want to try and eat the whole cake at once. Well, make them a bit sick, I suppose. They wanted to understand, and were able to understand that their open shares, stuff that just had read-write access for everybody, probably not such a good idea. Remediate those so that only the right people had access. Make sure that through data loss prevention policies, which they implemented through our discovery layer and then delivered with data loss prevention technology, people weren't able to mine certain information. In this case, it was around account information, weren't able to mine it and then siphon it off for their own nefarious uses, and then consolidate their information platform as well. Make sure they got rid of a number of their duplicate copies of information, rationalised how much they had, and again reduce risk there as well. I have one organisation that I'm working with, and they have a huge number of duplicate PST files. So PST being information around email that people bundle up and put into files, but they tend to be very large files. We're able to help them understand the scale of their issue, where their issue was, how their users were perpetuating that, and help them guide people in the right way to make sure that they had one copy of what they needed in the right place and it was locked down. Because, as we know, email tends to represent quite a lot of the lifeblood of information we have. It's amazing what you could find out from a PST file that somebody had, that somebody was able to unlock and use. So we come back to our analogy, and I'm looking at a kitchen drawer which doesn't look a lot like mine. I was curious actually, because I've noticed that only this morning there's a cork in there. I'm not entirely sure why that would be, but anyway, point being is that if you've got a well-organised cutlery drawer, you've got the ability to just dive in quite quickly and find what you need, get it out, and you're not at risk. I'm not going to end up with sticky fingers. I'm not going to end up with cut hands. I'm going to end up with, I don't know, the cheese grater that I wanted for the pasta dish I was making that particular night. That's what I wanted to share with you right now. I hope that ties in a little bit with what Kenny and Michelle said this morning. I did recognise an awful lot of what they were saying as pain points and concerns, and the work that Michelle's done with SharePoint looks terrific to me. We want to help customers do that across the board. Roddy's doing a lot of work up here in Scotland on that, and I'm looking at things generally south of the border there. But we're working with customers across the globe, and as I say, we've been doing that for the best part of 20 years. There's quite a lot of assistance we can bring to bear based on the experience we've gained working with organisations of multiple types across the globe. If anybody's got any questions, they're more than welcome to ask, or they can grab me later over lunch. It's very nice to be here, so thank you very much once again for having invited me, and that's it for now. I'm seeing this all over, literally all over. Organisations that we're working with, or we're trying to work with, most of them don't actually have, they haven't actually tried to tackle the issue yet. It's a bit similar to some of the DLP problems we were looking at a few years ago. At that time there was an ostrich mentality. If we don't ask the question, we won't know the problem, and then we won't have a legal obligation to deal with it. I was dealing at that time with one particular bank that had exactly that attitude. That came back to bite them quite literally, probably while their head was still in the ground, so it bit them somewhere. It was very painful. And a lot of that attitude seems to prevail around the regulatory requirements today. And as soon as we're able to have that discussion, somebody's brave enough to be able to bite the bullet and say, do you know what, actually we're really scared. Once you break that duck, it's that opens the door to being able to deal with this. And then people understand that actually it is a burden to do it in some ways, but actually the long-term benefits are fantastic. Once you've got proper future-proof policy in place, and you're executing that policy, and proving you've done it by generating the reports to have a look at how things are progressing. These organisations are finding that actually it's very much improving how they can do their work, how they can exploit the information they've got. So I can completely understand the viewpoint of we don't know how to start this process, and why people wouldn't necessarily have questions. Where are we? So real screenshots is what Diana was asking for there on your behalf. I took a smattering of them. So if we take a look at a share, and this is only one way of cutting this information, we can cut this a number of different ways. But for instance, we would have a series of share names, and this is always the way we can filter and organise in whichever way you want to do. But it's really interesting to notice how many inactive files a share might have. And you can set up policy to define what inactive file actually means. You can set up to promote what that actually the actual impact of that for a business is. So if you've got some inactive files, how much information does that actually represent? And then could we automate that process? Have we got enough information? Have we got enough confidence to automate archiving that information? So because we make the software that not only discovers but actually manages the information, the hooks from this report can be put straight into our archiving technology, whether that's cloud-based or on-premise based, in order to actively, and that's crucial, actively archive that information. Or if you felt so inclined, actively delete that information, or actively lock down that information via data loss prevention technology. That's the sort of thing that's unique in the marketplace, and that's the sort of thing that our customers are asking us for. They don't want to have to do this on an ongoing basis themselves. They want to be free to actually do the work they're employed to do, or deliver more projects, or generate more money, or handle more people. And that's what this allows people to do. This is what allows organisations to do. I mentioned the duplicate files earlier. This is straight out of the box. It's a report, or it's a couple of PI reports on duplicate files. And that the PST issue I was referring to, that represents for this customer almost half of all the information that they were looking at. That's a staggering amount of information. If they can get a handle on that, plus everything else, that gives them tremendous ability to make decisions safe in the knowledge that they're doing that on sound evidence. Some of those smaller slices of that pie chart as well might be extremely important. There might be very, very sensitive information in some of those small slices that they need to make sure that they're handling in exactly the right way. And in fact, I know for this particular customer, that absolutely is the case. If we've got a small amount of highly sensitive information, that's just as dangerous as a lot of relatively benign information. And also, last access. I mean, this one plays straight into archiving and archiving policy. We could filter on particular types of file, or particular types of user, or particular standards of information, and have a look at when that was last accessed. So, for instance, if you had, I don't know, if we were talking about there was an example this morning around information regarding children. Probably, and I will step back from knowing much about that, but what I will say is I'm imagining it's highly sensitive. That being the case, there will be extremely tight, I'm guessing, regulations around that information, and you want to make sure that with confidence you're applying those those procedures and those policies for retention, deletion, how that's handled and who's handling it. So we could apply multiple policies to that particular type of information, possibly through the SharePoint the SharePoint access that Michelle was referring to as well, and making sure that we're applying the right policy for the right standard of information for the right access pattern that they've had. So we're layering up how we handle that information. Does that make some sense? Does that resonate here? Is there people facing those sorts of challenges? Seeing a few nodding heads. And we can cut that information up, as I say, in all sorts of different ways for all sorts of different consumption and all sorts of different people, from a compliance, a legal, an IT, a user perspective, can log in from their standpoint and see information in the way that they need to see it, rather than everybody seeing the same thing or having to go to one particular person and say, sorry to disturb you from the job you're doing right now, but I need this information kind of now. Not a very efficient way to do things. Those were a few of the screenshots, and that allowed me, thank you very much for that, Diana, because that allowed me to not steal my own thunder this afternoon. And I can see some sandwiches arriving, although, yes, there they are. So I think I can hand over in a DJ Link kind of way now. Thank you for your time.